Sabrina's Holiday Spectacular Issue 3. So is this supposed to be the 90s Sabrina or some weird Sabrina Holiday Spectacular Sabrina? Because she's got the straight hairstyle of the 90s Sabrina and she's at school for once. Someone with glasses asks her to go to the Halloween ball with him and she reluctantly agrees. And then wishes behind his back that someone interesting would ask her out because she's tired of dating the same losers. So this is a continuity where Harvey doesn't exist. She then somehow understands what Salem's saying when he's not talking, and she shows affection for him for wanting to take her to the dance. She temporarily turns him into a guy, who thanks her and says he's been wanting a new look, rather than freaking out at being a human. It's impressive that she had the common sense to make him immortal to keep him from causing havoc. So she takes him to the dance. A girl cries saying that life isn't fair, and Sabrina thanks him for asking her for a dance. He really does learn fast, because he's never danced before, so that's unrealistic too. He wants to ask another girl to the dance right away, because the writer wanted conflict, even though you'd think he'd want to stay with Sabrina. So he spends hours dancing with her instead, when I thought her boyfriend was going to stop him from doing that. A month later, the girl that he was dancing with shows up at Sabrina's house with a pie because Salem invited her, and she was lied to that Sabrina was his cousin. It was impressively nice of Sabrina to turn Salem back into a guy just so that they could have dinner together, even though she disapproves of their relationship. She thanks them and says that the dinner was wonderful, with the story skipping right past it because the writer couldn't think of a way to make it interesting to read. So we'll never know what their conversation was like. It was probably just a normal, boring dinner. Sabrina says that he lives far away, explaining to her why he's not usually around, and the story ends with Clarice being glad that he's going to visit her for Christmas. She's just wasting her time with Salem and won't get to date an actual guy without feeling like she's cheating on him. So that's not very good news for her. In the next story, Sabrina hopes Salem will appreciate his gifts. He runs out of the house, and somehow, rather than just warping him home immediately, she wasted time flying around the neighborhood on a broom until she found him. Like I suspected, Salem's acting differently because of Clarice, who he's somehow still able to feel attraction to even though he's back to being a cat. And he's not a cat who used to be a human like in the 90s show. So because he showed up at her door, Sabrina has to awkwardly make up a lie about why she's here. She tells her Salem's not showing up at her house for Christmas. But then she cries, and that guilts Sabrina into turning Salem back into a human to humor her. He thanks her, but sadly, some jerk is smiling instead of freaked out when he reveals that the guy is just a transformed cat. After Sabrina denies it, and her broom gives away that she's a witch to him, she admits that he's right. Good thing she doesn't get in trouble. He sure is casual about this huge revelation. He must have known her for a long time and been desperate for proof that there was something suspicious about her. Or he's a witch too. Or he's just really brave. Somehow, Salem and Clarice can't hear her when she admits he's her cat when she was close to them earlier. He turns Clarice into a cat, which was her natural form all along. He transformed her first for the Halloween dance, and a few more times when she'd ask. This is surprising, but it makes sense. I'm just glad things worked out for Salem, and I'm glad that for once in this continuity the writer actually had the logical thing happen. Of course he's a warlock. And I love that his name is Roger. The sad thing is, I bet this was just a coincidence, because he doesn't have the same hair color as the teen warlock named Roger from the 70s comic, and Sabrina doesn't recognize him. But this looks like Salem from the 70s. Why would they have two teen warlocks named Roger? In an off panel, Sabrina asks why her aunts have to all dress in the same drab way as the other witches. So they try to show her that witches can be glitzy too, and they summon bows to their hats. Then, the next comedy page, Sabrina's all out of makeup. Tilda says generously that she can borrow hers, and she says she's not into green face powder, blue lipstick, and slime hand lotion. Hilda never used any of that before. She just wasted money on it as a practical joke, where she'd offer it to Sabrina. Then there's a better colored reprint of a story from issue 77. That's where I got the footage from. In the next story, Harvey wants to buy an expensive gold locket in the window because Sabrina's had her eye on it for a long time. Since when is Harvey a good boyfriend? This is really convenient. I wonder if the locket's gonna turn out to be magical. The title is making me wonder. She's grateful, but calls him crazy and a fool for spending so much money on her. I get that she wants to encourage him to have better spending habits, but she didn't have to make fun of him more than once. Harvey says that it costs him 6 months' allowance, and he wonders if she would prefer something more practical. So shockingly, he decides to return the locket she clearly appreciated getting and gives her a keychain instead, which makes her cry. No one would be that stupid. He'd at least go over it with her first. She says she doesn't want to speak to him anymore, and he gets the locket back. But sadly, the story ends there instead of showing him giving her the locket back. That story sucked. That was too depressing. In the comedy page, for some reason, Hilda and Sabrina are at a monster picnic. And Hilda asks if everyone here has a partner for the three-legged race. Them being monsters is thankfully justified because it means there's an excuse to have a three-legged character who doesn't need a partner. Then there's a comedy page where, after Hilda's happy that Sabrina's finally put on a witch costume, she says she's just going to the masquerade. I've never been to one, so I was kind of disappointed that the story ended there. In the next story, Hilda doesn't want to help Sabrina decorate the tree because she thinks the holiday sentiment is baloney. She was fine with the whole tree decorating in issue 77. She really does depend on the writer. The writing forces her to think that everyone being nice for a few days is disgusting. It's surprising that this is by Bill Gallagher, when this is a 70s comic style story, and yet this is one of the main writers of the 90s comic. I wouldn't expect him to want to go write the 90s comic 20 years later. I would have assumed that all of the writers would have moved on after 20 years. Either that or the 70s comic went on for a lot longer than I know, and I didn't know it because the site didn't include all of its issues. Sabrina decides to introduce Hilda to Scrooge because she somehow thinks it'll tell her how silly she's being, when, go figure, she likes him. And this is definitely ignoring a previous story in the comic, where she read about Scrooge and first discovered him. In fact, Hilda and Zelda used to hang out with Charles Dickens when he was writing A Christmas Carol. And Zelda spreads the misinformation that the guy that Scrooge was based on was evil, when he was actually a nice guy in real life. Look it up. So the writer really should have done his research instead of making people dumber. Somehow, Scrooge is aware he was living in a book for hundreds of years. That's just how he would sum it up, apparently. So Hilda and Scrooge waste time relating to each other. Scrooge somehow seems to remember Hilda. That's also how he was summoned up. Either that or he lives in a parallel universe and he was just teleported to here. And Hilda warps away to the mall with him like they did before off screen. She changes the Christmas garlands into snakes and the Christmas balls into bats. Surprisingly, when Scrooge tells the kids that there's not really a Santa, Hilda calls him out because children aren't fair game, and he calls her a nonsensical insult while a kid unrealistically cries about it. What kid actually believes in Santa anymore? I knew he wasn't real when I was 4. Hilda's had a soft side for children in a lot of stories. But this still doesn't make any sense because she was being written as the cartoonishly one-dimensional evil Hilda. And having a soft side for children didn't stop her from wanting to zap kids who sprayed Sabrina with snow when they were sledding. I guess she only hates kids when they do something to provoke her first. Hilda calls them mean and warps them away. And Santa gives her a doll that she always wanted. Apparently this is Santa because he already knew that. And it isn't surprised at her not even trying to hide her powers from everyone. So, the mall hired the real Santa? What kind of resume would he have? It was good of Sabrina to warp to the mall to try to heroically stop Hilda. Though it would have been smarter for her to just warp Hilda back home, from home. And it was a twist that the plot resolved itself without her needing to do anything. In the next story, suddenly Hilda is singing a Christmas song and says that even a witch can appreciate the holidays. She really is like 2 different people at once, and you never know which version of her you're gonna get. There has to be a term for that somewhere. She's been baking Christmas cookies all day, when you'd expect her to just zap them up. She's gonna celebrate the season by helping someone less fortunate. I'm guessing it's someone evil. No, that'd be in character. Instead, she doesn't know who to help yet. It's good that she's acting like this, morally, but it's not even trying to write her as in character. It should have been Zelda instead, so that I take it seriously. So she sees a hobo and warps into a restaurant. He asks how they got here, and somehow he immediately calms down instead of freaking out. She should have been drawn to point at him to explain this. I thought it was going to be a story where she'd keep trying to help people just to freak them out because she's too obvious about being a witch. She somehow thinks it's smart to tell him about the witch food she's feeding him over and over again. Somehow he immediately agrees to stay because Sabrina wants him to. She zaps up a regular Christmas dinner, and the story ends with Hilda complaining. At least there was a happy ending. I didn't expect that. But it only makes sense if Sabrina had to brainwash him into agreeing to it. He was all set to leave. At least it's interesting and memorable that Hilda was acting this way. I'd expected more of Sabrina, but at least this makes it stand out. In the next story, Sabrina somehow thinks it'll be fun to see the bell ring in the new year in Times Square. But realistically, it's completely packed with people. They just warped here in a puff of smoke. And all someone does to comment on is tell them not to smoke. You'd think the person right behind them would be freaking out at seeing this. Ambrose tells people to stop shoving, and he doesn't even try to hide that he's a warlock, wanting to turn someone into a reptile for a petty slight. This would be more in character for Hilda, not the guy who's telling her to calm down all the time. Meanwhile, a woman wants to touch up her makeup before midnight in case anyone would want to kiss her. Ambrose's beam hits her handheld mirror, breaking it, and reflects back at him, turning him into a frog. And somehow, Sabrina decides to follow the frog instead of simply casting a spell to freeze time in general, so that she can easily pick him up. If we're supposed to believe that him hopping away like a real frog would mean that any beam of magic would miss him. But because she's not thinking of that, she wastes tons of panels confusing people and going after him. She zaps up a pond with lily pads to attract him right where a bunch of people are, which results in it being reported on. She celebrates the new year with Ambrose at their favorite witch's restaurant, and he thanks her for that frog antidote. She wouldn't need one, she just point and turn him back to normal. The story ends with them wanting a fly casserole because the antidote wasn't good enough. The first story by Dan Parent was about Sabrina turning Salem into a good-looking date for the Halloween dance because she thinks all the guys she normally dates are losers for no explained reason. I just felt sorry for Bobby as a result. And then Salem randomly ditches her to fall in love with some girl he just met instead of staying with his own master. That made sense because it fit with him being girl crazy from the sitcom. But it'd be more interesting to see him cause trouble by using magic instead. But it was common sense for to have him be immortal. This is only confusing because the whole reason he agreed to go to the dance was because he cared about her so much. And then the girls invited to spend Thanksgiving with them. So Sabrina compassionately changes them back for her, which surprised me. But we don't even get to see what that dinner was like, so that was pointless. And then it turns out she was originally a cat who got turned into a human by another teen witch for the Halloween dance. Coincidences happen in real life too, so this is believable. And I'm just happy there was a happy ending for Salem. I wasn't expecting them to be able to keep dating with no deception. I thought it ended badly, like relationships usually do for Salem. Roger being a warlock is good because it explains why he immediately figured out Sabrina and was just smiling about it. Then there's a depressing story where Harvey gets told he spent too much money on a locket for Sabrina, and he somehow decides returning it is a good idea even though she clearly loved it. So she's upset with him. While he has cheated on her, he didn't do that in this story. And this is an episodic series, so that isn't enough to make me enjoy seeing him get hated for a mistake he got forced by the writer to make. He should get told she never wants to see him again because he cheated on her instead. There's a story by Bill Gallagher about Sabrina somehow thinking that zapping up Scrooge will cause Hilda to think she's being silly about hating Christmas for everyone being nice to each other during it. And go figure, they like each other, and Hilda causes mischief transforming the mall's Christmas decorations. But in a twist, she turns on Scrooge for telling kids that Santa isn't real when she was acting pure evil before. Then there's a story where Hilda's the most out of character she's ever been, singing Christmas songs and wanting to give a hobo mortal a Christmas dinner. And it's not like she's just having fun with him when she tells him that's all witch food to freak him out on purpose. She's sincere, and is surprised that he hates it. It's not lampshaded that she's acting weird. It should have been Zelda instead so that I take this story seriously. Because while she also dresses like a witch, she's always been the meek, nice one compared to Hilda. And it preserved the uniqueness of the story where an unexpected character is being charitable. The story just repeats the same joke about a mortal hating witch food, which was always forced, because Hilda would know better than to tell him what he was actually eating by now. And finally, there's the story where after Sabrina thinks it'll be cool to watch the Valentine's Square ring in the new year in person with Ambrose, and realistically, he just hates how crowded it is. He tells people to quit shoving, and he's called Chubby. And this caused them to try to turn the guy into a frog, which would be in character for Hilda, but not him. At least that was unique of the story. He had every reason to be in a bad mood, but it was still off-putting. At least he's wearing a top hat for once in the comic, and him barely ever doing that in the comic fits with him being out of character. And then Sabrina chases him around, which is probably justified because she's too panicked about the idea that people might step on him to think to just freeze time so that she could catch up to him and hold him still easily. She's also so panicked and distracted that she tells a mortal the truth about what's going on, because she's honest instinctively. And I guess the reason he had such a casual response and said his own cousin was a snake in the grass was that he assumed she was being metaphorical and was calling her cousin a mean insult for Quebecois people, and not a literal frog. And she zaps up a lily pad pond to attract Ambrose to it out of desperation. And she doesn't get in trouble with Stella for making magic obvious after it gets reported on, when this is about as obvious as Hilda making it summer in her yard. Stella showed in the previous issue that witches are very much capable of casting a spell on someone without having to have a beam of magic accurately hit them, because she did so without being in the same room as any of her targets. And yet Sabrina doesn't think she could just point and turn Ambrose back to normal. Why did she need to use a frog antidote on him, when we didn't even see her earn making it? Instead, the whole plot was wasted on a conflict that a witch would solve instantly. But it was believable that she was too panicked to think properly at the time, I guess. You'd think that everyone would know there was something fishy about that frog, because it clearly had Ambrose's black beard on it. Maybe they did and just didn't talk about it. Maybe they all assumed they were hallucinating.